So to get started, in 2005, 2006, while working for Koenig & Bauer, which is also known as KBA, I was introduced to the new G7 methodology, and we talked to Don Hutchinson, the inventor, and Idealliance, and we hosted a G7 expert certification course, and we had a variety of presses at our demonstration facility. We had DI waterless, we had offset sheet fed, the Rapida 105 and 106 models, and then we also had the larger, wider format models, the 142, and I think we also had a 162 in there as well. But the point is we had multiple presses, and it was a demonstration facility, so most of our day was spent optimizing and calibrating all the different presses for demonstrations for customers. And a lot of the time, customers would send in their own substrate, they would send in their own ink. We would have UV running on one press, UV inks on our UV press, then we'd have aqueous, and of course we'd have our waterless. And it was a challenge to keep those presses aligned to a similar visual appearance. Sometimes we couldn't manage it. The conditions were too disparate from one another, and we just got it as good as we could, where we had good dot gain numbers or TVI numbers that fell within specs like the older Swap or the older Grackle or ISO. And then we also had to maintain our gray balance, and sometimes we would compromise and take away from one to get that dialed in to meet the customer's expectation. So for example, we were tasked with stuff like this, lenticular. All right, very difficult. This was run on a Rapida 106, and we spent weeks perfecting this to get it to look like, this is kind of old, but you can see what we were up against. We also printed on a variety of stocks. Sometimes we had magnetized stocks. Sometimes we would have your typical board packaging substrates like you see right here. And then of course our high quality #1 sheets, uncoated sheets. We were using, I should mention that we also had a variety of screen sets we used. So we used Staccato 10 micron, Staccato, that's FM screening, Staccato 20 micron, a variety of hybrid things. So it was an amazing place to work, but it was also very challenging. And again, I was making a lot of plates, trying to tweak and perfect color on these different platforms or these different technologies. And when we were introduced to G7, we were honestly, myself and our press operator, Mike Eichler, who is one of the best offset litho press technologists in the world, no doubt about it. We were shocked at how simple and easy it was to align those presses to great gray balance, really good tonality, contrast in our shadow, midtones, and our highlights. As well, we were aligning on all these different variables and all these different conditions to a very similar visual appearance, which was virtually impossible under the conditions I just mentioned. Let me just pause here real quick to clarify that last statement. It was virtually impossible to align all those different presses in different conditions, inks, paper, etc., using TVI alone. Now, with G7, it made it a lot easier to get that alignment. But we do not ignore TVI as a secondary key process control metric to ensure that we maintain the press condition after we've aligned it to G7 gray balance aims. Okay, so let me go ahead and jump into the computer. I'm going to show you some examples, some real world situations where TVI just doesn't cut the mustard and never will. To get started, let's look at ISO standard 12647-2. This is a TVI based standard, and if you're not familiar with it, it is the international standard for process control of production of halftone color separations, proofs, and production prints. And part 2 covers offset lithographic processes. So this is a core standard and specification. Grackle 2006 and 2013 are aligned to, as well as some of the Foger specifications. G7 and Grackle deviate from the TVI requirement. And if we look at page 19, we will see that this standard prioritizes TVI over gray reproduction and gray balance, which is essentially putting the cart before the horse. TVI and density does not define color. When we use colorimetric aims for gray balance reproduction, like G7, that's what G7 defines, we achieve a very similar visual appearance, and it also correlates to the way a human observer would view color. TVI does not accomplish that, but there is some good news, and I'll get to that later. Let's take a look at the TVI requirements. Again, these are requirements, whereas gray balance and gray reproduction were simply informative. So this is a shall statement on TVI from the standard. And you can see here we have 8 different print conditions, and we have a variety of dot gain or TVI requirements that we must hit for 40, 50, 75, and 80. And now we're viewing mid-tone spread. So in addition to those dot gain numbers you just saw earlier, or the TVI numbers you saw earlier, we also need to be compliant to mid-tone spread, or the differences between cyan, magenta, yellow, and black TVI. The good news is the ISO TC130 working group, which addresses standardization in the field of printing and graphic technologies, had a meeting in Tokyo recently, and the working group members reached consensus that the widely used near-neutral method, or G7, should have an equivalent status with TVI as specified in ISO 12647-2. The ballot was approved, and you will see that the new revised ISO 12647-2 will include near neutral or G7 as an equivalent status to TVI. This is 10 years late. So here's the first press run to illustrate the G7 methodology versus TVI compliance or TVI calibration methods. And this is a Man-Roland 700 on a C1S stock, targeting Grackle 2006, and you can see that it passes the G7 targeted production tolerances. This press run is unique because of one thing. Now, this is what is outside of the ISO 12647-2 guidelines. We are running a 250 line screen or line screen frequency. The reason the customer wants to run this higher frequency is they have a higher quality image reproduction. As well, what's unique, we are using a UV ink set. It provides a better economical condition for this manufacturer since they can move the work off pressed right into bindery since it is dry, as opposed to letting the skid set for hours to avoid offsetting. So here we're looking at a press run where we have a pass to the G7 targeted production tolerances. This is a Man-Roland. And then let's take a look at the G7 conformance. Here we can see that our neutral print density curves for CMY and our black are pretty well aligned to the neutral print reference for G7. As well, we're passing the key metrics for tonality and gray balance, our weighted delta CH for color, as well as our weighted delta L for light or darkness. This is a good G7 run. Now, this press run was conducted to line 2 presses, so we had two Man-Roland 700s, both targeting Grackle 2006. The manufacturer wanted to line these presses so they could have a consistent press-to-press match and press-to-proof match. Now we're looking at both G7 validated press runs. Press A and Press B are very similar to one another. We have a good press-to-press match as well as a press-to-proof match if we had a proofing system targeting Grackle 2006. What's unique about this press condition is that we're using UV inks, and as we know, not all ink manufacturers are compliant to ISO 2846. As well, the transparent attributes and other attributes of different UV ink sets vary. So this is where we get in trouble with using TVI as a calibration methodology. 1, the substrate. 2, the screening. 3, the press condition using a UV ink set. And we could struggle for some time to achieve the requirements for tone value increase, as you saw in the ISO 12647-2, as well as the mid-tone spread. So what I'm going to do now is simply change the target tolerance for pass and fail to ISO, and we'll see what we get and see whether or not we pass ISO. So now we've applied the ISO 12647-2 pass-fail requirements, which is TVI based, and you can see that we are not compliant for our tone value increase. If I look at accuracy to target, we'll see where we fail. Even though the sample I showed you before, where we're targeting grackle and a G7 near neutral print condition for compliance, we passed with flying colors, and we had a similar visual press to proof match and press to press match. We accomplished the goals that the manufacturer defined for us. And here you can see if I was targeting a TVI based specification, I would not pass. You can see the mid-tone spread fails. I need to be below 5 at the mid-tone spread, and I'm at 6.06. I could play with press curves and do further iterations, and I might get that to be compliant. But again, that's a waste of labor and time, since the goal is a similar visual appearance. We have a visual match between the two presses and the proof targeting Grackle 2006. In this sample, we have a entirely different technology compared to the requirements and guidelines for ISO 12647-2. This is a digital toner press, a dry toner, and as well, we're printing on a plain stock. So this is not a coated substrate, yet we're targeting Grackle 2006, similar to the offset press runs you saw earlier on the Man-Roland 700, and we passed G7 color space press tolerances 2018. And that is quite an achievement, considering that it's on a plain stock. The characteristics of dry toner for their cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, and their overprints is radically different than the attributes of an offset ink, like a conventional aqueous ink. We have differences in trapping and transparency attributes. So using TVI to achieve this level of compliance and accuracy, we could not use TVI. In this case, what we applied as the calibration method was G7. The digital front end driving this digital toner press has the feature to implement G7 curves. Many solutions have that capability, from Konica Minolta as well as from Canon with Prismasync and several others. So if we look at inkjet, that's a radically different technology compared to offset. And again, we would be in the same situation where TVI calibration would not be successful in achieving this level of accuracy. Now, if we use color management only, ICC profiles, we as well could get to this. But on this press run, we chose to use G7 one-dimensional curves at the rip for linearization of the engine through the rip. As well, we applied ICC profiles to bring that wide gamut of that digital toner press into a smaller gamut, which is Grackle 2006. That's why we're able to achieve this on a plain stock. The press has a much wider gamut than an offset condition defined by something like ISO 12647-2. If I drill down, so you can see here in the G7 metrics for tonality and gray balance, I am compliant across the board. Okay, so I have good gray balance, similar visual appearance, so I would have the digital toner press aligned to those two Man-Roland 700s that you saw earlier. So here's the same press run when we apply ISO 12647-2 specifications that require your TVI, your dot gain, to meet a certain criteria. And you can see here, I'm a failure, and the cyan is showing a red X, and that's due to the mid-tone dot gain. Let's drill down a little bit. Solids are good. Overprints are good. G7 still the same. Good gray balance, good tonality, good match to the Manroland 700s that we saw earlier. And you can see here that my mid-tone dot gain on cyan for 40% and 50% do not cut the mustard. They are a failure. My mid-tone spread at 50% is 8.2. That's really far out. I could spend all day playing around with TVI curves to get that in. And of course, I would sacrifice my good gray balance that gives me that similar visual appearance. Okay. Hopefully these examples illustrate why the G7 calibration method is more practical and more efficient compared to using a TVI calibration method. As well, G7 and G7 specifications target colorimetric gray reproduction aims or near neutral aims to achieve a consistent gray balance across a variety of technologies like you saw in digital digital toner, as well as in digital inkjet, or unique conditions and offset like using exotic screening technologies, 10 micron staccato, 20 micron staccato, 300 LPI, and unique ink sets like UV or wide gamut ink sets like Toyo Kaleido or others, as well as the variety of substrates that do not fit into the myopic and limited specifications and standards that are using TVI as a core requirement. Well, that's a wrap for this video, everyone. Thanks for watching. We hope you found it useful and we appreciate your time. Please connect to us at Idealliance.org where you can find content like this video, and we hope you have a wonderful and productive day. Take care.